Tonight we are here to honor and listen to the presentation of this year's 2023 Humanities Teacher of the Year, Eric Smith, who happens to also be my husband. I told him I was going to find a way to get on the stage, and here I am. But his presentation tonight is on a subject that has become a little bit of an endeavor that's gotten close to his heart, which is prison education. He's been going every week for the last few years up to the Auditorium County Correctional Facility and teaching a variety of classes. As y'all know, if you know Mr. Smith, he teaches geography classes for us and history and philosophy now that Dr. Stone has retired. And I think he's taught several of those subjects already at the facility. And just to very briefly tell you what this award is, every year the Mississippi Humanities Council chooses about 30 Mississippians throughout the various universities and colleges in Mississippi to recognize and honor for their work in the humanities. And so this year's recipient is Eric, and as part of that, he'll be going to Jackson in a few weeks to be a part of a banquet, and then he has this presentation tonight. So that is, I guess, the introduction. After his presentation, we are going to, I know y'all aren't here for extra credit, but in the off chance that you are, there will be a QR code on the screen. And so we'll have that pulled up. And then we have one of our representatives here who is also a retiree from Northeast, Carla Faulkner, who's going to come up and speak just a minute about the prison education reform and about the Mississippi Humanities Council. And then we're going to have a period of question and answer so that if there are any questions that maybe come up that you have for Mr. Smith or for Ms. Faulkner and Dr. last name Stephanie? Yes. Gaston. Gasco, I'm sorry. Gas something. I'm sorry. She has my name, so Stephanie. So we'll have a question and answer. But to me, this topic is very, very interesting. If you don't know much about prison reform and prison education, I think that tonight will shed some light on maybe a topic that you don't know a whole lot about. So I will pass this off to Eric. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank y'all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it, whether incentivized or not. I've been teaching classes at the Auditorium County Correctional Facility, like Stephanie said, for a couple of years now. I've been teaching history and philosophy classes there. And honestly, my involvement in prison education has been something I've kind of backed into. It's something I'm passionate about now. I think prison education offers has an awesome potential for rehabilitating prisoners and reducing the risk of reincarceration after they are released. But it's something I've kind of backed into. My boss, when I was hired here by Division Head Carla Faulkner, when she retired, she started working with the Mississippi Humanities Council, coordinating classes, college classes in prisons. She sent out an email to instructors that she knew, asking if anyone was interested in teaching classes at the Auditorium County Correctional Facility. I sent back a bare bones email, just trying to get some basic details on it. Before I knew it, she'd roped me in, right? So it's something I kind of backed into, but it's become one of the most rewarding things that I do professionally. And I think teaching at the Auditorium County Correctional Facility is rewarding for the same reasons that teaching in general is rewarding. There are a lot of reasons why teachers become teachers. For one, I get paid to talk about history and philosophy and ideas, and things I'm just like naturally into, and people have to listen to it. There is no other context on the planet where those three things happen simultaneously. That's awesome. You get summers off, a lot of time with family. But I think if you ask teachers what they found rewarding about the occupation of teaching, I think most would somewhere on their list have something that I've heard one teacher describe as light bulb moments. And these are moments that happen in the classroom where students they transform physically. They go from looking something like this. You're a teacher, you're familiar with this expression. This is the kind of standard default, like affectless disposition that you get a lot when you're standing in front of a classroom. But occasionally, there are these rare moments where something seems to switch, and students go from looking like this to something like that, right? And why like that? But like that's the goal, right? That's what you're trying to achieve. You can see it happen, like the physical reaction. Students they lean forward on the edge of their seat, their faces lighten up, their voices go from monotone to polytone, and for a moment, they are able to share with you the enthusiasm, the passion, the excitement that you have for the subject that you were teaching. For a moment, they become engaged in the subject, and they realize why it's interesting. They realize why people talk about it, right? Different classes, this happens more or less, but I've never had more of these moments than at the courses that I teach at the Alcorn County Correctional Facility. I think there's probably a lot of reasons why that's the case, why you get this kind of light bulb moment more frequently there. This is, I guess, where you insert jokes about captive audiences and all that. Maybe that's true, not sure. I think I've had students tell me at Alcorn County, that course is the highlight of their day, right? Go into class, being in class, the thing that they look forward to. I think that's probably rarely the case in my classes in more traditional settings. A lot of times I think students in college are looking for distractions to take their mind off of the rigors of the college schedule, the difficulties of classes. I think at the Auburn County Correctional Facility, my class is the distraction from the harsher realities of prison life, right? There's a lot of reasons why I think that this is the case, but I think this openness to engagement that you see in these settings is important in terms of understanding why prison education can have the transformative kind of positive effects that it does. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We're going to loop back to that, but keep in the back of your head this openness to engagement, openness to the possibilities that education can provide us. Before we get to that, I want us to think about this word for a second, penitentiary, and what kind of images come to mind when you see this word? Throw them out there if you want to. Bars, yeah, that's fair.
Stone.
What's that?
Stone.
Yeah, bricks, stones, cinder blocks. Convicts, yeah. Barbed wire, razor wire, yeah. Yeah, I think it's probably common across the board, right? I think it's an accurate representation of what prisons are like, which is interesting. This would be difficult to do in this kind of setting, but I think if we were to start a conversation about why, as a society, do we put people in places like penitentiaries, I think we'd get a bunch of different answers. But probably first on that list would be some mention of retribution, right? Prisons are there to punish people. They are society's way of righting a wrong, kind of rescaling the scales of justice. Maybe we would talk about deterrence. Prison offers a disincentive for people to commit crime in the first place. Then maybe we would start to talk about rehabilitation. But I think that's probably the order that we would have approached those subjects. I think that's interesting. I think it's a little bit ironic, the reasons I'll talk about in a second. It's probably, talking about punishment first, probably an accurate portrayal of what prisons are actually like in America today. There's a lot going on in the slide, a lot of numbers. The main takeaway here is that in America, we have a lot of people that are incarcerated, right? We got about 1 million people in state prisons, another couple 100,000 in federal prisons. We have about 500,000 people that are in jails, waiting a conviction, waiting a trial. So 1.5 million people in total. We lock up people for a variety of different reasons, some violent, some not. The fact of the matter that is the vast majority of these people, over 95%, are going to be released from prison at some point. They're going to attempt to reintegrate back into the community that they've been absent from. They're going to try to rejoin society as a whole. And the statistics about what happens to people during that process are pretty bleak, right? So this is the most recent stat from the Bureau of Justice. Within 5 years, about 3/4 of people that are released from prison end up being rearrested again. About 50% or so end up being convicted of a crime, and then about 46% end up returning back to prison within 5 years of being released. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about recidivism, right? It's the rate at which people return back to prison or get rearrested after being released, right? So I think this focus on retribution is probably an accurate description of what prisons are actually like. I think rehabilitation, if it is a goal in prisons today, it's not a goal that we are accomplishing, right? People aren't emerging from prisons changed individuals. They have a high likelihood of returning back to this place. We're not reducing the crime rate of people that are actually released from prison, right? And this is kind of interesting, and it's kind of ironic, particularly given the history of American prisons, where they started, right? So I'm a history instructor. This is like a natural pathway here. So if you look at the history of prisons in America, like incarcerating individuals as punishment has not been something that we've always done. Go back to like the colonial era, the late 1700s, we might incarcerate you after committing a crime while you waited trial in jails, and they function the same role they have in society today. But after you were convicted of a crime, punishment was much more likely to take a different form. It might be corporal in nature, it might be beaten or whipped, maybe executed, depending on the crime, or it might be financial. You might have fees levied on you. Maybe you get forced into a labor system, right? A public lease system, or something like that. But incarceration wasn't a big part of that story until we get to the late 1700s and the early 1800s. And the ideas of prisons actually trace their origin back in America to the Quakers and reform-minded Quakers in Philadelphia. Their idea was that punishment at the time, corporal punishment, financial punishment, wasn't doing a good job at rehabilitating offenders, at correcting the underlying problems that led to crime in the first place. So their idea was an alternative. Let's create a place, a penitentiary, where people could be placed. They basically they would put them alone in the cell, let them think about what they had done. It was kind of like time out for like adults or something like that. And then over that process, you would internalize the wrongs that you had committed. You would feel grief about those wrong actions, and you would emerge from this process a rehabilitated individual. You would see penitence, right? Repentance. This is a place where you go and be reformed, realize what you had done wrong. So it's initially a Quaker idea. By the time we get to the early 19th century, the early 1800s, there's a couple of different models about how rehabilitation is supposed to work in prisons. So we get the Auburn system that's associated with Auburn Penitentiary starting in the 18-teens. The idea here was, again, just like the Quaker system, the Eastern State Penitentiary, you get a lot of alone time, a lot of isolation, a lot of time to think about what you've done. But the Auburn system incorporated work into this idea. So the idea is that people in the Auburn system would work in the mills, and then through hard work, they would learn the value of day's labor, they would learn the value of property, they would be rehabilitated to this process, right? But across the board in the 19th century, as these prisons are being developed, they are viewed as places where rehabilitation can take place. There's environments for rehabilitation, right? It's an essential part of the idea behind prison as punishment. And education, since the beginning, has been wrapped up as a tool for rehabilitation. If you go back to the Quakers, they thought literacy was a really important part of rehabilitation. The idea was that you needed to be able to read the Bible in order to seek repentance, right? By the 1820s and the 1840s, secular education is becoming a more and more common thing in prison systems across America. By 1844, Sing Sing prison in New York has a broad array of courses that are offered, pretty varied curriculum that includes courses in history, astronomy, geography, physiology, physical education, and apparently knitting. What's going on here? This is actually a picture from 1950. You can tell this guy not excited about knitting. Again, he wants to go to PE. But yeah, it's becoming more and more of a common thing. During the Progressive era, early 20th century, around 1920, progressive reformers also took up prison education as a powerful method of rehabilitation. And by the time we get to the middle of the 20th century in America, this is kind of the consensus, right? Maybe not the reality, but the goal of prisons is, again, to be an environment of rehabilitation, and education is an important tool within that process. Middle of the 20th century, there's several pieces of legislation that are broader education legislation more generally, but each of these contain a provision that increased funding for prison education, right? So this is kind of the national consensus again. Prison, place for rehabilitation, education, an important tool for that process. And by the time we get to the 1980s, it's kind of reached a zenith, right? So higher education programs exist by the 1980s in 60% of prisons across the country. This includes workplace development education, vocational education, and also college classes. There are 350 college education programs nationwide available to prisons, and the vast majority of these are in-person classes. They're places where instructors are going into the prisons, having face-to-face classes. Of course, I think like 13% are correspondence classes, something like that. So like I said, we reached kind of a zenith in the 1980s, kind of a high point of the rates of prison education in prisons across America. And as a zenith, obviously, things start to change. So by the time we get to the 1990s, forces are kind of pushing against prison education. There's a couple of reasons why that is the case. We're going to look at two of them. A few reasons why that's the case. We're going to look at two of them. One of which is academic. There is a meta-analysis that looked at the effect that prison education has on recidivism rates. A meta-analysis is just a study of a bunch of studies, right? They're trying to statistically analyze a bunch of different studies. The idea being that one study will be, results from multiple studies will be better than just one study. So this meta-analysis looked at a bunch of rehabilitation programs across prisons, 8 of which were education programs that were designed to reduce recidivism, and the study found that only 3 of those were actually effective at reducing recidivism rates. The rest of the studies found no correlation between prison education and recidivism. We'll talk about why that might be the case in a little bit, but the effects that this study had were chilling on prison education funding across the country. Additionally, one of the co-authors of the paper, a guy named Martinson, goes on and writes a public policy article in a journal called Public Opinion. The article's name is What Works? Questions and Answers About Prison Reform. And his answer to that question is basically nothing. There is no means of rehabilitation that we have statistical evidence of being successful, right? So again, this has a chilling effect on funding of education and rehabilitation programs across prisons. Unfortunately, this is happening at the same time we're experiencing a prison boom in America. So from 1970 to around 2015, the prison population in America grows by about 600 times, sixfold, right? It increases dramatically. It's expensive to incarcerate an individual. I think the national average right now is about $30,000 per year. So this obviously presents a challenge for budgets, right? The more prisoners you have incarcerated, the more expensive that is. So people that are allocating budgets for this have choices to make, right? How are we going to spend this money? If you're making these choices, trying to figure out how we need to allocate funding in terms of prisoners, we need to put it for increased security, infrastructure, or rehabilitation programs. Like you can point, oh, sorry. A lot of people pointed back to that study as reasons why education budgets need to be cut in prisons, right? So you get a prison boom starting in the 1970s. Of course, in the 1980s and the 1990s, bipartisan attitudes towards prison and criminal activity in general, they tend to kind of coalesce around this sort of tough on crime attitude, right? This is a bipartisan thing. And a piece of evidence you have for this is this 1994 crime bill that gets passed. Pretty infamous today. It's gotten a lot of attention more recently. A lot of people point back to this 1994 crime bill as part of the reasons why mass incarceration is a problem in America today. Whether or not that's fair, it's debatable. There's a lot of things that are included in this 1994 crime bill. It increases maximum and minimum sentences for a number of crimes. So it does increase the amount of people that are in prison and the time that they actually spend there. It increased funding for infrastructure at prisons, increased funding for police force across the country. But tucked away in this bill was provision that made it where prisoners no longer had access to Pell Grants, right? So after 1994, one of the main sources of funding for higher education in prison dries up. And you can see the effect on the graph here. Over a little bit more than a decade, participation in higher education programs in prisons dropped by about half, right? So federal level, about 19 to 10%, state level, 14 to 7%, right? So we go from kind of a zenith of prison education in America in the 1980s to sort of a nadir or a low point here in the 1990s. Fortunately, this is not the end of the story, right? There's been a slight sea change since the 2000s, and part of the reason for that is there have been a number of meta-analyses that have been published since 2000 that suggest maybe that original meta-analysis that we looked at in 1975 Either it was wrong for a variety of reasons, or prison education has gotten better since, and we're seeing opposite results, right? So we've had a number of meta-analyses that suggest that no, actually, education does in fact reduce recidivism. In 2000, there was a meta-analysis published by Wilson et al. That suggested that being exposed to prison education reduced your risk of recidivism by 11%. McKinsey 2006 by 16%, and Hess et al. By 7%. Right, so a number of stories that are studies that are suggesting the opposite of what that 1975 study suggested. In 2007, Congress passes the Second Chance Act, which is in general kind of a broad prison reform act that's designed to reduce the number of people in prisons and recidivism rates. But part of this included funding for the largest meta-analysis of the effects of education on recidivism to date. And you can see the citation for the paper up there. I'll look at the details of it. It's funded by the Justice Department, the Bureau of Justice, executed by the RAND Corporation. It looks at 57 different studies over a 32-year time period, and its findings were in line with the previous meta-analysis that we just looked at. It did find that there was a drop in recidivism when people were exposed to education in prison. A person who is not exposed to education, they had a 43% chance of recidivating. A person that did go through a prison education program had a 30% chance of recidivating. So it dropped the risk by about 13 percentage points, right? So lots of evidence since 2000 that suggests, no, actually prison does have the effect that you would expect it to have. It does actually reduce recidivism. You might think 13 percentage points, like that's not mind-blowing, right? It's not a huge number. So this raises questions. Is it worth the investment? Prison education costs resources, it costs money. Is this a good place to put those resources? That RAND Corporation that we looked at, that study, the meta-analysis, it ran a cost-benefit analysis that suggested that it was. The way that they did that was they imagined two groups of hypothetical people that are released from prison. Both have 100 people in it. One group, Group 1, did not go through a prison education program. Group 2 did go through a prison education program, right? So given the meta-analysis that we looked at, we would assume that the group that did go through the prison education program would have a lower rate of recidivism. Each person that gets rearrested is obviously going to cost money and cost resources. So that reduced rate of recidivism is going to be associated with a reduced rate of expenditure, reduced cost as they recidivate back into prison. So the reincarceration costs for Group 1 were estimated to be right around $3 million. Because less people were recidivating in Group 2, that cost went down to around either $2 to $2.25 million. Obviously, educating people in prison, these programs cost money. If you don't educate people in prison, there are $0 associated with that. The estimate was that educating this group of 100 prisoners would have costed anywhere from $140,000 to $174,000. If you weigh those out, you get a net reduction of expenditures in Group 2 by about $1 million, right? So just from a pure dollars and cents perspective, this saves money in the long run. The study estimated that the break-even point, the point at which investments in education, the point at which recidivism would need to be dropped in order to make investments in education worthwhile, is about 2 to 3%, right? So as long as you're reducing recidivism by about 2 to 3%, it's worth the money. Anything over that, and you're saving taxpayer dollars in the long run. So from a straight, crass dollars and cents perspective, it's a pretty easy argument to make. And this doesn't even take into account the societal cost of removing someone from a community and incarcerating that individual, right? Each individual that gets incarcerated is a part of a community. They're a father, son, mother, daughter, brother, sister, best friend, right? They have relations with that community. Removing them from that community, their absence is felt. It creates a ripple effect through the community, and there's a societal human cost that's associated with that, right? So there are financial benefits with lowering recidivism rates through education. But there's also humanitarian benefits, social benefits that come with this as well. This raises an interesting question, right? My background is in the humanities, so of course as I'm researching this, the thing I become most interested in is the thing that is least easy to answer from like a scientific and data perspective, right? The thing that really gets me interesting is, why does education reduce recidivism? What are the mechanisms that allow education to actually reduce recidivism? My first guess, like my initial assumption, was that it had to be like practical or pragmatic in nature, right? Maybe going through an education program in prison increases the chance that you get employed afterwards, and that makes the reintegration process in the community a lot easier. A person who is employed is much less likely to commit economic crimes, much less likely to sell drugs, steal a car, something like that. Having a job, maybe it's the thing that's driving this reduction in recidivism we're seeing through these education procedures. The evidence on this is kind of mixed, right? The initial RAND study that we looked at, they also looked at 21 studies that measured the effect education had on employment after people were released from prison. And the initial findings were about 12 to 13. So going through a prison education program increased your chance of getting a job by about 12 to 13%, right? The issue is that the quality of those studies were fairly poor. This meta-analysis ranked studies based on quality. If you just looked at the studies of extremely high quality that were random experimental trials, they found no relationship between prison education and employment, right? Which is surprising. This correlation is being driven by lower quality studies. And the danger there is maybe these lower quality studies are subject to selection bias, right? If you're not randomly picking the subject of the trial, maybe you're allowing a prisoner to be a part of a study because of good behavior, good work ethic, that kind of stuff. Maybe that's influencing the study. Maybe the people that were part of the study were just more likely to succeed anyway because they were harder working, etc., right? So there's not a lot of good statistical evidence that, knocked out evidence that education in prison leads to employment. So it opens a question. Like, this creates a situation where there are people that are being released from prison, they're trying to reintegrate into the community, trying to find a job, failing to get a job, and yet are still not recidivating, right? Which kind of blows my mind. Like, how is that possible? There's a paper by one of the co-authors of that RAND study that we've been talking about. It's funded by the Justice Department, that big meta-analysis. It's got in Bozic. He writes a subsequent paper in 2017 that looks at that RAND Corporation study and spends some time kind of speculating, okay, if it's not employment that's reducing recidivism, what's going on here? And he talks about it in a lot of different ways. They speculate that education in prison might reduce antisocial cognitions. It makes it more likely that you view other people instead of as objects that can be used to get what you want, instead as other people that have rights, right? They have the idea that education can change an offender's perception of reality. It improves cognitive development, improves moral development. It improves their capacity for expressing empathy, right? I think I'll say that prison education might change authoritarian thinking styles. Most people that end up incarcerated have what psychologists refer to as an authoritarian thinking style. They think of things in terms of black and white. Education might allow people to think about things in more subtle and nuanced, gray sort of ways. That makes it easier for them to calculate the consequences of actions. But when I'm reading this, all this started sounding like really familiar to me because it seems to be the same answer to a question I get a lot, which is, what's the point of a liberal arts education anyway, right? Our curriculum at Northeast is grounded in what's called the liberal arts, right? So if you're advising, like accountants, for instance, a lot of times you get questions about why do I need to take a literature course, right? From an engineer, why do I need to take a philosophy course, right? These are questions that you get all the time. And the answer I have, I think it's a good one, but it's kind of a long one, right? The liberal arts education has always thought that part of an education should be acquiring skills, right? It should be the practical accumulation of skills and knowledge that allow you to succeed in whatever field you go into. I think as a society, though, we tend to emphasize that aspect of education and forget another aspect of education that's kind of embedded within this model, right? So the liberal arts model of education, it goes back to antiquity. The idea of the liberal arts was it would teach you the arts or skills that would be necessary to be a free citizen, a liberal citizen in a society, right? This is a sum total of things that you needed to know to be a free citizen, to be a functioning human being in society. So yeah, it's a list of practical skills that you have to master before becoming a free citizen. But in that idea, the idea was that going through this process was edifying. It would change you as a person. Going through this process of accumulating these skills would change your character. It would instill virtues in you. It would make you a better person when you emerge on the other side of it, right? The liberal arts is always associated with this idea that education is edifying. I teach in the humanities. The humanities are part of the liberal arts education, and in the humanities, we like to talk about stories a lot, whether they're historical or fictional. The idea is that by analyzing stories, by analyzing people in particular situations, understanding that, you have to know something about those people. You have to understand their motives, their desires, their goals, right? So understanding a particular story gives you a broader understanding of what humans are like more generally. It gives you insight into the human condition. Understanding Romeo and Juliet, for example, involves understanding young love and how crazy that can make you, right? Understanding Julius Caesar involves understanding power and ambition and how that can change your behavior. That you topple the Roman Republic. Understanding the greatness of George Washington makes it such that you have to put yourself in George Washington's shoes and imagine how hard it must have been to step away from that power, to let go of that ambition. Understanding Oedipus Rex, I guess, involves understanding how fate can make it such that you end up falling in love with your mother. I don't know. I mean, but that's kind of my point, right? Understanding these things stretch our capacity for understanding the human condition more generally. These stories are at the boundary of the human experience, right? If we can put ourselves in the shoes of these people, then we can much more easily understand people in more mundane, more normal situations. The idea, and this is the fundamental tenet of the humanities, is that understanding stories involves understanding people, and when we increase our capacity to understand people, we expand our capacity for empathy, right? And empathy basically is just broadening our sense of community. It's our capacity to see ourselves in others. So it's easy to see ourselves in ourselves, right? It's really easy to see yourself in your family. It becomes harder to see yourself in your neighbors in different cities, in different states, different countries, and different continents, right? Expanding your capacity for this human expanding allows you to see yourself as part of a broader human community. And when you do that, it's harder to do wrong to people that you view as belonging to your group, right? So the broader your community, the harder it is to do wrong to people. To circle back, right? We started this by talking about this extreme openness and engagement to education that I find time and time again with my students at the Auditorium County Correctional Facility, right? I think this is what allows this kind of powerful transformative process that happens in education, right? Education has always been about expanding ourselves, especially when you come into it with that open mind, with a willingness to question your bias, your assumptions, your beliefs, with a desire to change. Education has the capacity to make us better human beings. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Carla Faulkner, and I am retired from the Northeast, and I now work for the Mississippi Humanities Council, and I have the pleasure of coordinating the prison education program. The Mississippi Humanities Council sponsors programming like you heard tonight throughout the state of Mississippi so that we can reflect on exactly the kinds of questions that Mr. Smith raised tonight. It helps us to understand each other by studying our history and our culture. So our programming, whether it's a lecture like you heard tonight, a panel discussion on a hot topic, a museum exhibit, encourages civil discourse as we explore those issues that help us to understand ourselves, the very things that he pointed out. We at the Mississippi Humanities Council are well aware that no one does more to promote the humanities than our teachers in the classroom. Therefore, every year we ask each college and university in the state to honor one of their humanities scholars with the title of Humanities Teacher of the Year and ask them to share their scholarship. We thank Mr. Smith for sharing his scholarship tonight, and he will be honored at the Public Humanities Award on March 24th in Jackson. Now, our motto is the humanities are for everyone, and we are particularly proud that in the last few years, we have been able to take that philosophy to all Mississippians, including the 17 to 19,000 who are incarcerated. Currently, we are working with 5 community colleges and 1 university in 8 prisons. We expect to announce the expansion of that program to 2 additional facilities in the next year. In addition to our 4-credit college classes, we sponsor book clubs in our prisons. Currently, we are running book clubs in 4 prisons with 2 more scheduled to begin after spring break. Our participants read novels like Jesmyn Ward's Sing and Buried Sing, which takes place partly in Parchment. John Steinbeck's East of Eden, which deals with themes of evil and good. They're reading memoirs like Trevor Noah's Born a Crime and Brittany Barnett's Knock at Midnight, where she retells her experiences of growing up with a mom who's incarcerated and how that led her to nonprofit work helping to reduce sentences. We've got a group starting after spring break that's going to examine the war on drugs through a book called Chasing the Scream. They are looking at those hard questions, and those aha moments are happening both in 4-credit courses and through our book clubs. NEMCC is a private nonprofit corporation funded by Congress through the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we thank you for allowing us to help bring the humanities to you tonight. But I think that after that presentation, y'all may have some questions. Do you want me to? You want me to? Okay. And let me introduce to you, we also have with us Dr. Stephanie Gaskell. Dr. Gaskell has worked with prison education programs at Tulane and at Loyola in New Orleans. She is currently helping Northeast get its prison education program up so that the students will be eligible for Pell, and it can go from just offering a few humanities courses to offering full degrees. And so we've been meeting with people all over campus, and we were at the prison yesterday. But let's get to questions. What questions do you have for Mr. Smith or for Dr. Gaskell about prison education?
How many people are in your classes?
We're pretty small as of now. I think the largest class I've had has been about 10. Right now, the course of teaching has about 5 students in it. A lot of that is size restrictions. The classrooms are pretty small, so I don't know what it would be, but small classes.
This is also a small prison. It has about 300 people in it. At Parchment, we have classes. We have about 80 people in the program, about 30 in classes. And again, you're dealing with thousands of people instead of a few hundred. Other questions?
Have you ever had any of your students, have you ever met them outside of prison?
No, I've only been there a couple of years, so like the opportunity for that has not been the case. Yeah, not as of yet.
What?
Yeah.
Dr. Gaskell, you want to answer that question?
So in my time working with prison education programs, I've probably met 4 or 5 of my students once they've been released, and that's just like a whole different ballgame. Trying to help people readjust to life on the outside, but definitely the connections that we formed in the classroom made a big difference when they got out. And I think this speaks to the point you were making about what is the reason that education reduces recidivism in the way that you're talking about. And a lot of it is that human connection that you make with people in a classroom that then carries over once they get out as well.
I'm going to add one thing there, and that is that, we tend to think, oh, well, let's get these people trained to be welders or some other skill. Folks, there are people who are formerly incarcerated that are PhDs, they are medical doctors, they are doing all kinds of professional work. The organization the national organization that focuses on higher ed in prison. The director and the assistant director both are formerly incarcerated. Some incredibly successful people doing incredible work were formerly incarcerated. Other questions?
Got a question. Did I understand you right that there are 4 classes offered? 4?
We, here,
Uh-huh.
we are doing 2 right now. So there's Eric's class, and then Bill Stone has a speech class. Robbie, we've also offered
Introduction to philosophy and New Testament survey.
and you've offered both halves in US, right?
But what about the whole catch where they didn't think they could take those? Isn't that,
You can talk about that. How about you?
I think this is, at least so the situation I'm at now is one of the reasons I only have 5 students is because the students that were entering into the program were told that they could only take either me or Dr. Stone's class. I don't know where that comes from, but it becomes one of the challenges. Communication in the prison system leads to a lot of misunderstandings on my part and on their part. It's one of the big challenges that the process in prison.
Working in a prison environment is challenging. It, by definition, has different goals than we have in a college. You know, we are an open communication, open environment, and they're a closed environment. And so it's often difficult. And, their priorities are security. Our priorities are education. And so, yeah, those kinds of things happen. And it's part of it, and you have to be patient. Other questions?
how long are the classes?
So right now I'm only going up there once a week. So the class, it's like a night class basically, about 3 hours. Class.
They have to have the same standards you do. They have to meet class the same number of minutes. They have to complete the same objectives. Everything has to be comparable to what they're getting. They are getting college credit from Northeast, and so that's the same whether you're meeting class on campus or you're meeting class at Alcorn County Correctional Facility.
I would say so far, on average, they've done better than students at Northeast. Maybe it's selection bias, but worth noting, maybe surprising. Average grade tends to be a little bit higher.
You might say we're limited right now to humanities courses. Yeah. You want me to explain that?
Okay, so as Mr. Smith told you, in the 1990s, funding was cut for these programs. These students, and Dr. Gaskell, you correct me if I say something wrong, but these students were eligible for Pell, and they could use Pell grants just like you do to pay for college. And then in the 1990s, with the tough on crime bills, that got slashed. And that meant there was no way to pay for college for a lot of them. Eventually, some things will start happening to take that place. The Mississippi Humanities Council got a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation focuses on the humanities, just for exactly the reasons that Mr. Smith brought out tonight. And through funding from them, we fund 2 courses each semester for Northeast. So two are it. However, Congress passed a bill that made this population eligible for Pell Grants again, in theory, on July of this year. Now, for it all to get done, programs up and going, it's going to take longer than that. But that's what Dr. Gaskell is doing on campus right now. Northeast also has a grant to help get the prison education program fully ready for Pell. So those students will have a way to pay for college. And Dr. Gaskell, who's the expert here, has been helping them figure out how to make that happen. Because it's not easy. You've got to offer comparable services. Just like you can go to counseling and get services. You've got the Student Success Center. We've got to find a way to make those kinds of services available. Other questions?
I'll add 2 questions. What class do they usually try to take, like, between the two? They usually pick?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Which class between the two do they usually pick, like, try to group them?
Like between speech, philosophy, that. Honestly, I'm not sure how that decision-making process works. I just show up and got people in my classroom. So,
Do you usually, like, know the convictions of your students?
well, you can look it up. It's public information. I was warned against doing that because the idea was maybe it would bias you against them or something like that. So first semester I didn't at all. I have since because once you get to the classroom, it's a relationship just like any other, right? So you become curious if you're human. So I don't know, it's hit or miss. It kind of depends on the person and my relationship with them. But I mean, by default, no, I try not to.
Do you feel safe? I keep saying stuff. But Brian Stevenson has a famous quote that we are all better than the worst thing we've ever done. So think about it. And when you're dealing in this environment, it is a very valuable thing to remember. We are all better than the worst thing we've ever done.
Do you feel safe?
Yeah, I've never, once you get in there, the process of getting in there is weird. You get patted down like you're in a prison. It smells bad. There are bad things associated with it. But once you get in there and you start teaching, it just feels like any other classroom. I don't know, stuff kind of melts away. Start teaching. It feels normal.
Okay, you're a man. I want Stephanie Gaskell to answer this question. Little bitty Stephanie Gaskell.
It's funny to say, but I don't even really think about it anymore. I heard somebody referencing this today, and I think it was maybe you, Carla, but I had, so now I work with the program at Loyola, and I was walking out of the prison the other night, and one of the officers said to me, you know that if anything ever happened in here, the students would make sure that you're okay. And I just sort of looked at him and thought, I guess that's true. But I think what often happens is exactly what you said. It's pretty similar for me, that when it's a weird process walking in and out because you're walking through gates and bars and all the bells and whistles and everything. But then once you get into the classroom, it's really just a classroom like any other, and except for exactly what you said, the students are paying attention. They've read everything you've asked them to, and they come with questions, and they're engaged, they're ready to learn. So I don't even really think about it anymore as being something that I should be worried about.
Other questions?
So you say the communication is bad about how many classes you can take. Is there something that you can do or ask to get,
That hadn't happened every semester. The first semester, we had almost the same students in his history class as we did in Bill Stone's speech class. We're not real sure what happened in the meantime. Will it be addressed? I'm sure it will be. We met with them yesterday. We didn't even know that issue at the time. But, Miss Coleman, who is the, kind of trying to be the liaison with the prison, I'm sure she'll try to say, we can let them take both classes.
Well, part of the problem also in the prison is
Sorry.
Part of the problem in the prison is the location of the classes. They're not only taking academic classes, but they're also studying for the GED to get their high school equivalency. So the space is limited. So those two classes kind of have to share space with someone else. And something else that I wanted to mention, Pell Grant, and I know some people are sitting here because I have a financial background, so I'm thinking the prisoners are getting financial aid and they're going to get those checks in them, to take home with them. The Pell Grants that the prisoners are going to get, now correct me, they do not get a refund. All the Pell Grants they get is to pay for the classes that they're taking, to pay for the university. So it's not a money-making thing for the prisoners while they're there. It's all to benefit them just to be able to get the classes.
And Stephanie, what's the statistic that he estimates that for every dollar spent on prison ed, it was $5 back. Savings for taxpayers between recidivism, being able to return home and take care of family.
I just want to make a little point for a minute. People in prison are taxpayers. I just want to say that for a moment. This is whenever somebody's buying something from the commissary, people are getting things from their family. These are people who are paying into the system as well. So it isn't as though these are two completely separate groups. People in prison, even when they're there, are paying taxes and paying into the system also. So it's money. Yes, money well spent. That's a good way to put it.
More questions?
Do you think the math and science classes are equally or less important than today?
Yeah, a student for humanities, it's a professional class at this point. But no, I mean, look, the statistics hold for education as a whole. It applies to vocational education. I think the process of education itself is edifying. Like, this is something especially for the humanities. I mean, it's something the humanities explicitly emphasize, but I think the effect holds.
But it is the Humanities Teacher of the Year award.
That's that naturally.
Other questions?
Can you talk about why you're focusing on this being more state inmates and not just local inmates that are in jail? Jail, prison, longer terms?
Yeah, there's two different roles. So prisons are places for people that have been convicted of crimes and they're sent there on punishment, rehabilitation, all that. Jails are places where people are supposed to temporarily await a trial. The way the criminal justice system works, sometimes that's a very long time, years even. But that's the way two systems are supposed to be divided. Jail's a temporary place where you wait for a trial. Prison might be sent afterwards.
Obviously, you don't want to start a course if people aren't going to be there to finish it.
Isn't that something that like dollars or like a little bit sometimes?
As if the drawings. Okay, but let me introduce someone else. Melody Shen is an art teacher here at Northeast, but she is volunteering and teaching art at Alcorn County. And Melody, you want to talk for just real brief about your experiences?
What was the question?
Well, she asked if they ever made drawings or anything, art or small gifts for him, but not for him, but in general.
Okay, this is my first experience teaching at Alcorn. And I was asked to do this through Prison Rights Initiative with Louis Bourgeois. When I started this, I was, thought, okay, it'll go really great or it'll totally crash and burn. I'm volunteering, they can't fire me. So the whole idea was, okay, well, I'm going to get in there and see what I can do because I have my students 2 hours once a week. And the goal was to teach a studio art-based class within that amount of time and see if I could do it effectively. The thing is, I did, and it worked, and they did some amazing work. The further that it goes into the prison system itself, beyond where the students are, to kind of answer your question is that, yes, other students, other prisoners who are in that system are hearing about what's going on in the class, they're learning about what we're doing, and I have received a drawing from one student from another prisoner being one of my students that wanted to be in the upcoming session. So it goes well beyond the group of students who are in that particular class, and that's a really important thing. You're fostering all different types of alliances. You're getting further into their educational processes, not just the ones who are there that are really going this. It goes much more than this. I'm pretty sure that something very similar happens with your classes too. They hear about it, they want to know about it, they know about it. And those students that I've had have been exceptional. They have done a very, very good job.
And how many people wanted to take your class and had 2 spots in it?
Well, when they first signed up for the class, I was thinking we might have a few. They had 80 people.
And only, 10 of those are getting to actually do it. Other questions? Anyone else?
How does like receiving assignments compare from a normal classroom to a prison classroom? Like, do you have to change your teaching style or anything like that?
What's the last part?
Do you have to change like your teaching style or how you receive assignments or what you assign or anything like that?
The biggest thing is missing things like Canvas. So communication with students is, I can see them once a week. We're there 3 hours, so there's nothing that slips your mind like that's gone for the week. Everything. They don't have computers.
And you know how his memory is.
Yes.
This is the problem. No, they don't have computers, so papers are handwritten. Yeah, it changes a lot of things in those regards. Getting the materials and stuff, I don't have digital copies of things. Everything I have to print out. It feels like an older form of teaching, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, very different experience. The logistics of it.
And you didn't have computer. Or
No, for a while there, I didn't have anything as well. So like we would print off PowerPoints and look at PowerPoints and that kind of stuff. I've gotten a TV now, so yes, I have access to that visual experience. Any questions? Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Oh yeah, I really appreciate it. Please scan this. Whether or not you had an instructor offering extra credit, this keeps attendance as well. There's a survey in it. So yeah, if you don't mind, please scan this so that we can track your attendance. Thank you all for coming.
When we started tonight, I failed to mention that we have light refreshments and I assume for refreshments in the lobby over by the art gallery. So just all the way around the building on the other side of Anderson, if y'all want to join us for that. Thank y'all for coming. I appreciate it. I hope that you learned as much as I did. And have a great night.